Hello, everybody. You're very welcome to this slightly delayed session being presented by the Tomorrow Cities team. You'll remember the scintillating presentation last night about democratizing risk. So I'll start more or less from scratch. If you want to join in with the presentation, please use Wi-Fi and register on this Menti screen, and you'll be asked to do some voting on different preferences as we go through the presentation. So while you're doing that, let's introduce the team. I'm delighted to have Thaisa here.
Hello.
As my co-host for the evening. Ramesh Gurgayan from the National Society for Earthquake Technology and has traveled all the way from Nepal to be with us. And our colleague and friend, Anil Pokharel, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority in Nepal. It's absolutely fantastic to have Anil with us. Joining us from Istanbul and London, we have, as I see on the screen, Yaya, who's an urban economist, Roberto Gentilis, a structural engineer. In the corner, we have Mark Pelling, my co-director, Gemma Kremen, an engineer. Carmina is also an engineer, and Emin, joining us from Istanbul, is our GIS and computational expert, one of them. Okay, so let's think about tomorrow's cities. Next slide, please. We are all aware in the Understanding Risk Conference that global populations are expanding at an amazing rate. We know that up to 2 billion new citizens will move into urban centers globally by 2050, 2 billion new citizens, and that 95% of these people will expand cities in the global south. You're all aware of the headline statistics. 70% of the global population will be urban. 70% of everyone on the planet will live in cities. Nearly 1 billion people will be exposed to major damaging earthquakes. And climate change will worsen many of the existing growing hazards of flooding, storms, landslides, other things. And finally, and the main focus of tomorrow's cities, is that the poor and marginalized in these expanding cities will bear the brunt of this disaster risk. There were some lovely presentations last night that really made a strong point of that. Next slide, please. There is a big opportunity, though, that with this massive global challenge, really, it's one of the top challenges facing the planet at the minute, comes an enormous opportunity. 60% it is estimated of the urban development that will exist in 2050 still hasn't been built yet, is in the active process of development. So this is a one-off, time-limited opportunity for us to try and protect those future generations. A century of lives can be changed by the actions that we take over the next decade or so. So the prize couldn't be higher than it is. The challenge couldn't be more important. And Tomorrow's City sets out to enhance, we're really thought about the objective of the whole project, to enhance sustainable urban development through risk-informed planning and decision-making. And we're going to come back to those ideas again and again by understanding the consequences of today's decisions on tomorrow's risk. Next slide. Our mission is simply to try and reduce disaster risk for the poor in cities that haven't been built yet, in communities that don't exist yet. Next slide. Briefly, historically, we've worked across 4 cities for the last 3 years, and within that work, we've developed some really good ideas. And in today's presentation, our team are going to show you some of the ideas we have, but really most importantly for you is that Ramesh is going to constantly intersperse this with examples of this working in the real world. We could have used the other cities. I think Kathmandu has got some really good examples for you. Next slide. We are now expanding. We're already actively engaging with Nablus and RAPTI. I would talk about RAPTI later, and a more tentative stage with Dar es Salaam. And we are actively looking for 3 other partner cities to join us in this next phase of the project. Next slide. Over the time we've been working on this problem across these 4 cities, we've developed what we call the Tomorrow Cities Decision Support Environment. And that is not a tool, it's a whole process. It's almost a philosophy that is broken down into different stages. We start with participatory future visioning, then we move into bringing those visions into virtual understandings and plans of possible futures. Then we subject these futures to really rigorously thought out hazard scenarios, collect the impact measurements from them, and then bring the impact measurements to people and get them to think about them and really deeply reimagine what risk means with trying to use a lens of the most marginalized in society. So let's start. Thaisa is going to describe the game, and then we'll go through each of these stages quickly. Thaisa.
Hi, hello everyone. Max, can you move to the next slide, please? Okay, so today what we're going to do is we're going to play a game together, and to play that game is very important that you log into Mentimeter. If you haven't done so yet, we recommend that you do so, and the link is still available. It's menti.com, and the code is 848874486. And this game is basically about demonstrating Tomorrow City's decision support environment. So this is a process that takes months, and we're doing it now in a few minutes, but just so you can get a flavor of what are we doing in the cities. And to play this game with us, we are using an imagined territory as a reference, and we call this territory Tomorrowville. So Tomorrowville is an imagined site, but it draws on data from 2 of our partner cities, which are Nairobi and Kathmandu. And you can see here in the slides, in the left-hand side, today's land use of Tomorrowville. And just so you can have a reference, Tomorrowville has a current population of 40,000 people, and we are working with the future. So we're planning for the future. And this future means 30 years from now. So whenever we say future, we're meaning 30 years from now. And in this future, we're projecting a population of 80,000 people, okay? And in this land, we are working with a few hazards. We're working with earthquakes, flooding, and landslides. So these are the main hazards that we're subjecting to our visioning scenarios. Next slide, please. Okay. And then to play this game, we're also assuming, and this is what happens in real life, that we're working with disaggregated stakeholder groups. So we're working with groups that somehow represent the diversity of the city and also the power imbalances that we have in planning systems. For the sake of this demonstration, we're not going to role play, but you're assuming that we're playing the role of planners and policymakers. But when you're voting for yourselves, okay? Next slide, please. Okay, so can you please press the button again? So these are the main steps that we're going to go through today. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to ask you a question, and you're going to answer this question using Mentimeter, as I said. And this question is about the aspirations that best capture your vision for the future. Okay, so we're first talking about aspirations, which refers to the first stage of Tomorrow Cities. Then we are transforming your aspirations into visioning scenarios. So visioning scenarios are detailed plans that have several layers of social and built environment layers, and they also refer to both urban plans and policies. Then we're subjecting your visioning scenarios to natural hazard events to know how these visioning scenarios respond and perform in relation to those hazard events. It's raining quite strongly now, so I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Finally, we're asking you a second question, which is, which potential impact of hazards matter more to you? Can you go to the next slide, please? So we use that question to really assess the things that you value, and we use the things that you value to build a democratized concept of risk. So instead of us scientists imposing a concept of risk, we're building this concept of what risk is based on these impacts that you are assessing yourselves. You're going to see how that plays out. Next slide, please. And a key element for us to do that, a key device that we use both in Rio, Tomorrow Cities, and today, is what we call the wheel of urban assets. Because when we talk with people about everyday urban challenges, future urban challenges, experiences of risk, it's very hard to organize the way we think. So we're organizing our thinking through these 7 dimensions. I'm not going to read through all of them, but just to give you a taste here, when we're talking about hospitals, schools, bridges, transport, we're talking about macro infrastructure and facilities. Just a second. If you're talking about wanting to live closer to your neighbors, we're talking about social assets and so on. So we have these 7 dimensions. We're not working through all of them today, but just so you know, this is what we use to navigate the questions that you're going to be asked today, okay?
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thanks, Thaisa. That was great. Okay, so now we're starting to play the game. So we want each of you to follow the general guidelines that Thaisa gave you. And we're going to start with this idea of future visioning. So this is a complex process. Ramesh will talk more about it in a few minutes. But what we wanted to do is just to give you a glimpse of some of the methods that we're using to try and make this work. So again, I'm going to hand over to my fantastic colleague Thaisa to bring you through this.
Okay, hi again. So now we're simulating that we are in the first stage of Tomorrow Cities, which is future visioning. And we're going to ask you the first question via Mentimeter. So just to see, is everyone connected to Menti right now? Yes, I see head saying yes. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? Before I ask you the next question, just also to explain that in Tomorrow Cities, future visioning, which is the first step, is about asking people, what does a good future city look like to you? So in real life, we ask that question to people. It's a slow process of building a collective visioning statement together. And this process goes through several stages. So first, we sort disaggregated stakeholder groups. Then we discuss everyday life, and by doing that, we surface values and visions for the future. Then we translate those visions in spatial terms. So we transform those visions, those aspirations for the future, into actual spatial propositions, and we complicate that in the face of hazards. And then we discuss policy, and we discuss that also with ideas of scale and temporality. Next slide, please. Okay, so the question that we're asking today is a very simplified version of that. And instead of discussing it, you're just going to vote for it. So I'm going to ask you now, which aspirations would you prioritize? So what is the emphasis that you want to put for your vision for the future? So do you want to emphasize, for example, is it more important to you that the future emphasizes schools and hospitals close to residential areas? This is the macro infrastructure dimension. Is it more important to you to protect heritage sites, cultural practices, and to build education about disaster risk reduction? Or is it more important to you low density with plenty of green and recreational spaces? And remember that we're talking here about Tomorrowville, okay? So this is the imagined site that we're using as a reference to ask those questions. Max, can we go to Menti now, please? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to answer this question, but before Max is moving to Menti, just so you can see the responses in real time.
So the first slide or the first question should appear any second. You're welcome.
Yeah, you can start voting now. So I'm going to repeat the question. Which aspirations best capture your vision for the future? Is it about heritage sites and education? Is it about schools and hospitals close to residential areas? It is about low density with plenty of green and recreational spaces.
You need to give...
Open the vote.
And just to say again that this is an illustration of the sort of aspirations that would come up in real future visioning exercises.
What?
It's not. Can you refresh the page? Yeah, just vote here.
Can you tell everybody that?
Yeah, if it's not working, just refresh the page. Okay, so just a few more seconds before you finish voting. We have people here.
35 votes in at the moment, so yeah, we have a few yet to come.
So most people, you're prioritizing schools and hospitals close to residential areas. So what's going to happen is that that aspiration is going to turn out into a visioning scenario that puts emphasis on that aspiration, and you're going to see how that happens. And in real life, we will be discussing why do you value these things, why they matter. So what are the values underpinning those visions? Here, we're not doing that, but you can get more or less the sense. And of course, we would need to articulate those visions. So ideally, you have a scenario that's actually speaking about multiple visions at the same time, if that's possible.
And remember, these visions aren't being invented by the team. They're being raised within focus groups and other community and municipal engagements.
Okay.
Okay, I think we could move on.
So just so you remember, you prioritize protected heritage sites and education, if I remember correctly.
So next slide. So now that's given a very small glimpse at a way in which we can involve people in defining the priorities for the urban development. That took 3 minutes. We've been working on this, for example, in Kathmandu. The stuff Ramesh will show you shortly has been going on for 2 years. We've learned quite a lot and taken a lot of wrong turns, but that's, the type of engagement is months rather than minutes. And at the end of that, we end up with an agreed vision, and we'll show you some examples of this, of the way things might go forward. But so that we're able to confirm that vision, and that we're able to start doing the calculations that we need to understand risk within those visions, we then take on a process called visioning scenarios. And Emin has come joining us from Istanbul, is our lead on this stuff. Emin.
Thank you, John. So as the next step in this game, now we take your aspirations as policy dimensions, which influence the urban plans, basically. Then these urban plans and policies constitute a visioning scenario as a whole. And in reality, the process of scenario development happens in an interactive environment with stakeholders where they co-map and collectively generate these visioning scenarios around the table, working for hours maybe. But then within this participatory process, and then the main guiding components are the future aspirations and of the stakeholders and the reducing disaster risk in the future. Then to represent the outputs of such an intense process in this game, here we present 3 predefined exploratory scenarios that present your aspirations in future visioning exercise. So for example, if you have selected schools and hospitals close to residential areas as an aspirational priority, we have designed scenario 1, where we have a significant amount of hospitals and schools spread around the area. Then if you have aspired for heritage and education focus on DRR, then the second scenario is yours, which focuses more on heritage preservation, where historical and cultural areas are protected and moreover enlarged. Then the third scenario focuses on low-density urbanization, aiming to keep population density at the minimum, with green and recreational spaces better distributed over space. Then, as the last step, by using bespoke techniques and approaches at the back end, we translate these components into computable data sets to feed into computational modeling that we will be elaborating more in the forthcoming sections. But before that, we want to show how a visioning scenario is developed by real people using real data in Kokana district of Kathmandu, Nepal. And for that, I want to introduce Ramesh so that we will continue with him. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So I'm taking you to Kathmandu now. From all these theoretical framework and the concepts developed, we use that in southern part of Kathmandu Valley, in the two of the wards in Lalitpur metropolitan city. The plan was to have the 50,000 additional populations in the next 20 or 30 years period of time. We started with the interactions with the communities, including the city's officials, several rounds of interactions and discussions to collect the aspirations that they have in terms of the future development of their city. That's the number one. And then once we have all these type of the interactions and series of interactions for different focus groups, individuals, and the the larger workshops, we had the idea that, okay, this is what the community want to do. And then the next step, next slide, please. So, we translated that, as earlier mentioned, from this conceptual, the aspirations of the people towards a more tangible, detailed plan in terms of the buildings, the infrastructures, even the people, every household, how many number, what age, what educations, person with disability, not for the existing buildings, infrastructures, and the people, but the future, with a lot of randomization, using of the census and projection of that, and then including the community's aspirations and the visions for their development. We detail out that. There are many other aspects, not only the physical, the cultural aspect. You can see here, the communities want to preserve the traditional outlook of the buildings, but our contribution is to make them resilient. So traditional looking resilience buildings. So we had a lot of support for the cities, whatever are their aspirations, because Nepal is a highly tourism-based country, so we have to preserve that, but at the same time to make them resilient. So with that type of the detail, we prepare a very detailed buildings, infrastructures, the social, cultural, economic aspects of the city, and then we subjected that for the further calculations. Over to you, John.
Thanks a lot, Ramesh. That's fantastic as always. You can see the difference here, that there is an aspiration and there is a soft process of engaging with people and trying to get ideas of what's important for them in the future. And then we change that into these detailed pictures. And we know every child, we know where they go to school, we know which roads they take to school. If there's a landslip, we know how that's going to affect their interaction. It's a really detailed model. All of this then is subjected to a series of hazards, and we could run a full session on the detail of the physics-based simulations we're using for this. But I'm going to hand over to Gemma to give you a short picture of where we are. Thanks, Gemma.
Thanks a lot, John. Okay, so I can't see the live screen at the moment, so I'm going to do my best. But what we're doing in this case is we're going to subject our visioning scenarios to a series of high-fidelity, physics-based, multi-hazard simulations. Okay, so in this case, we're going to assume that we're subjecting our visioning scenarios to one earthquake, one flood, and one debris flow. Now, we're using high-fidelity physics-based simulations to be able to capture the effects of these hazards at every point in the urban system. Next slide. Now, there's many different possible ways in which we could capture the effects of these hazards on each of the visioning scenarios, which is the point of this part of the process. Next slide. But in this case, we're going to capture these effects in terms of 4 impact metrics. The first is the total number of people that are displaced as a result of these 3 hazard events. The second is the total number of children that are left with no access to education. The third is the total number of people that are left with no access to healthcare. And the fourth is the total number of workers that are unemployed. Now, there's a few important features of these impact metrics. The first is that these impact metrics are designed to capture broad societal effects of these hazards. We're not interested in measuring narrow dimensions of impact like economic loss, which simply really only reflect the lived experiences of only the high-income people within each visioning scenario. The next main feature of these impact metrics is that they're objective measurements of impact. And that word objective is really important, and we'll return to it later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. But we calculate these impact metrics by coupling our multi-hazard simulations with detailed engineering calculations, as well as detailed representations and understandings of the interactions between the physical and social systems of each visioning scenario. Now, each visioning scenario is, of course, different in the physical and social characteristics behind it, and that is reflected in the effects of the hazard events on each of the different visioning scenarios. So each of the visioning scenarios will differ in terms of the impact metrics and their magnitudes. Okay, so hopefully as we scroll through each of the different visioning scenarios, and you can have a look at the different impact metrics associated with them, you'll be able to remember which of the visioning scenarios would best represented your aspirations, and you can take note of the impact metrics associated with that. But don't worry, we will return to these impact metrics later on in the presentation. But for now, I'm going to hand you over to Ramesh, who will talk about calculating impact metrics for those visioning scenarios in Coconut.
Yeah, again, taking back you to Kathmandu from this virtual Tomorrowville to the real, the municipality in Kathmandu. Once we detail out all the buildings, the infrastructures, the population, the economy, the cultural aspects, their funeral routes, the temples and others, detailed plan together with the linked fragility functions and the vulnerability functions, the detailed hazard map. We calculated the impact for different potential development options, the urban plans. The Kathmandu Valley Town Development Authority had proposed for this area as a smart city, and then they had the 3 land use plans, which we detailed out, considering the bigger infrastructures there, the transmission line, the fast track, and the outer ring roads and others, together with the community's aspirations and the visions and the development. So we had these different development options already prepared, and then we detailed out that for the future buildings and infrastructures and the population, and we calculated the risk. Still, these plans do not consider the hazard, the consequences of different hazards. So once we change that, considering the the level of the hazards, the impact will be much different. Even now, just a little bit of the changes proposed by the KVDA, you can see a slight difference. For the first scenario, more than 55,000 population displaced. The second one is less than 50,000. The third one is, it's about 45,000 or something like that. It's just small because, we have not considered the hazard impact. But the idea is, it's not only the spatial distribution and the different plans, it's implication of different policies also. For example, if, the 100% of the future buildings are compliant to the code, what will be the implications in 50 years? If only half of them, then what will happen? So from those several policy interventions and looking different options, the whole idea is to convince the city mayors and the communities and building of the interactions and then facilitate them to make the right decisions. That's the overall, and that's how we are working in Kathmandu. Over to you, John.
Thanks a lot again, Ramesh. You can see the clear linkage between ideas like Tomorrowville and the way in which we can use that as a test ground for policy development. And Ramesh is talking about how this is already feeding into thinking about policy within Kathmandu. And Neil maybe will talk to us more about that in a second. So we've now looked at visions, the detailed ramifications of those visions. We've talked about the computational modeling and impact metrics. And now we come to something that we're particularly proud of, the idea that the simple understanding of risk in terms of asset value and whatever could be modified, if not completely changed, by a deep engagement and participatory engagement with the urban poor particularly, who are the ones who are in the firing line when all this plays out in the next disaster. So I'm going to hand over to Roberto and Yaya to tell us how this is working at the minute.
Thank you, John. So I'm not also seeing the presentation in real time, so I'll do my best here. So we're moving here to the idea of the fact that risk is experienced differently. So it's really important here to highlight initially, before going into this discussion, that we introduced the impact metrics, which are objective measures of the effect of a hazard event. And risk, in contrast, is a subjective experience for each member of a group. And we expect people to have different experiences towards the impact metrics that we introduced, and accordingly to have different subjective priorities towards these impact metrics. And that's what we will be trying to capture in this exercise that we will be doing here on Mentimeter as well. Next slide, please.
Yeah, could you please turn down your volume slightly? I think it's causing some feedback.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, moving to the next slide then. What the question that we will be trying to ask here is basically which impact metrics matter more to you in case of a hazard event. And we will be focusing on three urban asset clusters that include a set of impact metrics. And I'll be going through them here quickly, just to clarify what they are, and then I'll run you through how to do the exercise on Mentimeter. We're starting with we're focusing on three clusters here: micro infrastructure, macro infrastructure, and jobs and livelihoods. Micro infrastructure alludes to residential impacts and housing, so it includes the number of population displaced. Macro infrastructure includes different types of infrastructure, including education and health. So the number of children with no access to education and the number of individuals with no access to healthcare are the impacts included within that cluster. Jobs and livelihood is the economic cluster we're using, which includes the number of workers that are unemployed. I'll ask you to go to Mentimeter now, but before we do so, I'd like to clarify what the exercise we're doing is. So we're doing a ranking exercise. So we will be asked to rate these three clusters based on their importance to you. You will have 100 points in total to assign to the three clusters. And you cannot go beyond those 100 points. So if you, for instance, decide to assign micro infrastructure 50 points, which means that it is highly important for you because you're assigning a high value to it, the rest of the 50 points can go to macro infrastructure and jobs and livelihoods. So now I'll ask the hosts there, Taisa and John, to move to Mentimeter and jump directly to the ranking exercise. And I'll give you perhaps a couple of minutes to do that. And as I assume that you will be seeing the results, so I'll run you through what you should be seeing in a sense quickly, because I'm not seeing it directly on my screen. But you should see the graphs, and as you input your weights, your ranking, your ratings, you should see that the priorities of the group starts changing in a sense. So you should take note of which one is the most prioritized for your group. And obviously in this exercise, there should be group discussions into why these specific clusters are being prioritized. I'm seeing now macro infrastructure is the most highly prioritized one. And also, it's really important to highlight here that the weights or the percentages that you're seeing here on the screen right beside the graphs are weights that identify how important the specific cluster is to your group. And we will be using these weights further down the line to identify the risk and assess each visioning scenario based on risk. And I'll be handing over to Roberto to run you through this process.
Thank you. Yeah. I would ask the host to go back to the normal presentation, please. And probably I should start because I don't see the live version of the video. So as Yahya was mentioning, we are now able to reflect the priorities over the clusters of impact metrics that you selected to the value of the impact metrics that Gemma has described before, that are derived from each hazard scenario, so flooding, earthquake, and debris flow, for the different visioning scenarios. So if we combine those objective measures of risk, the impact metrics, plus the subjective visions or priorities over the metrics, aka the weights, we can combine them all together to get what we call an overall
Could I
risk
ask
indicator.
other people in London to mute their mics? I think that might be the problem. We're getting some feedback. Sorry, Roberto, go ahead.
Yes. So again, with the impact metrics and the priority weights, we derive an overall risk value, which is calculated for each scenario, visioning scenario, which means that we can now rank, next slide, please. We can now rank the visioning scenarios in terms of their overall risk. So you will see on the left, the visioning scenario with the lowest amount of risk, with the definition that you contributed to define. And this is going to be used for our decision support, which means that for our specific case, with your weights and our calculations, scenario number 2 is the one with the lowest amount of risk. Scenario number 1 follows, and scenario number 3 is the one with the highest value of risk. What I want to emphasize here is that although the objective measures of risk are fixed, a different weighting from you could have led to a different, let's say, overall risk and therefore ranking of visioning scenario. What you cannot see here is the final step of this process, which we cannot run in this role-play game due to time issues, is that you are part of a group that define the priorities and therefore the rankings, but this should be run in parallel for different groups representing different social characteristics. And therefore the final exercise in our methodology involves what we call risk negotiation, which means that representatives of each disaggregated social group would negotiate together their rankings and their optimal visioning scenarios to go to the next phase, which is the final phase, which John will now introduce, which is the visioning scenario assessment. Over to you, John.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Roberto and Yaya. That was fantastic. So, okay, you've got a very small glimpse into the way the idea works. We go through these processes, and all of them can be considered as a method of collecting data which is relevant to the decision-making process within the city, and also making sure that that data is surfacing the views of people who are going to experience the shocks when they come. So the next stage is for me to really emphasize that in no sense is this a decision-making environment. It's a decision support environment, and our idea now is to all along we've worked with the community groups, we've worked with the municipalities, we've worked with the national agencies, and now we're essentially handing over the process as it has emerged to them and deciding, you know, to what extent do you think this is enough for you to start making final decisions? It's unlikely. So they might want to go back and reinforce some part of this, or maybe take a different route from a particular part along the way. So the whole thing has enriched the engagement of the whole planning process with lots of different groups in society. I'm going to hand again back to Ramesh, again to help you to try and understand that this is it's a research project, so we are still learning every time we go into work, but it's learning with the stakeholders in the field. And Ramesh will show you some of the ways we're planning to take the next few steps over the next few months and into the final year of our project. Ramesh.
Thank you very much, John. The next slide, please. Yeah, the research is very good, but the problem is how we can do it in different cities, different countries. how to replicate, how to expand, and how to continue even after the research project is over. That's the the challenge. In Nepal, what we are doing is some of our initiatives. We already had a training program with support from USAID to go to all the municipalities in Nepal for the localization of disaster risk reduction and management. And then we built in some of our concept of tomorrow cities research on that process. So, we had the recent elections, and then we had new mayors. We reached out 753 municipalities. Out of them, we already completed more than 700 cities. A 2 days training, and part of that was the in terms of the the understanding risk part. We built in the tomorrow cities concept. It's not only the today's risk, but we have to look the tomorrow's also. We have to check whatever development planning in terms of the risk. So that's what the major concept is. And we reached out to almost all the municipalities, and it will be completed by January. We have already done for more than 700. About 50 are remaining, and then we'll continue that. That's one. While we are developing a very comprehensive training package that may continue as a as a lobby and as a the continuous training program, open source, different modules and others, and we may reach out some of you also to continue and support that the initiatives. But that process is going on. But at the same time, for the time being, we are expanding that concept from the Kathmandu Valley small area to another bigger city in the west. That's a provincial capital that the government is planning to build. There are already the 3 of the municipalities jointly combine their efforts, their territory, and then planning a bigger city there. Again, about 65,000 population, additional population in next 30 years. They already had some concepts over there. So from our end, from the tomorrow cities, what we are going to do is we have a very large network of the the different disciplines, different the expertise. We're supporting the cities through that, and then supporting the implementation of tomorrow cities decision support environment so that they make the right decisions. And then the many mayors, I mean at least 3 of them, they came to our program. All of them say that it's not for us, it's for our grandchildren, and then the city for the next 100 years. And then they are asking for the support, and then we are doing that. So this is how we are taking it forward in Nepal, and then trying something similar in other countries as well. Over to you, John.
Thanks so much. Yeah, and that idea of systemic risk, we always think of that as sort of a semi current effect. It goes on for generations, and this work is definitely, people talk to us about their grandchildren and the RAPT experience. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, sorry. Could you go back a slide, please? Yeah. So, okay. The timing has been strange. I think we're still within our allotted time. This is you've got a glimpse of some of the processes that we're developing. We're open to co-production with everybody in this room. We're really looking forward to conversations around that. But I think you can see the direction of travel. I won't say any more, but I would like to finish by inviting Anil Pokharel, who's the CEO of NDRMA in Nepal, to just say a few final words. Thanks, Anil.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Sorry. So I really would like to thank the Tomorrow Cities team for doing this comprehensive presentation. I'd like to again take you back to Nepal, where we're experiencing some of the fastest urban growth in the world, something of a rate around 4.5% in some select cities. And as you drive around, or as you kind of hike along the mountains, you could see kind of houses popping up every other week. That's the fastest growth of urban settings. So it is in this complex situation how would NDMOs like ourselves would help local governments make decisions. So this is where the Tomorrow Cities, the ideas of, again, future risk really comes in handy for us. It's complex. Often at times, risk assessments are abstracts. But this is where, again, the idea to engage with municipal leaders, municipal elected mayors comes in so much of really good value. And this is what we've been doing with Tomorrow Cities project with teams in different parts of the world, with academicians, with institutions like NSET, with academic institutes like the Institute of Engineering. We're working with them. And then reaching out to municipal governments. There's another initiative funded by the Japanese government, mainly helping the local governments, there's 18 of them within the Kathmandu Valley, to come up with their local disaster resilience framework. So using all this information and this process, not only the risk information, but also the process, we're embedding it into the periodic planning for the next 5 years, so that the mayors would then be able to kind of like use this to vision their future cities program. What we fear is some of these scenarios that we presented. So 50,000 people in next 20 years or 30 years. What I personally fear is that's going to happen in 5 years or in 10 years. So that's the kind of scary situation. It's happening at a place where it has one of the highest earthquake risk, highest landslide risk. So that's the situation that we confront with daily on our situations. What also I want to share with you all is we, again, working with the Tomorrow Cities team, but also with other groups of, again, agencies. They're working on risk information to bring in all this set of data into a common national portal, into an open source platform. It's called Bipad portal. Bipad is a word in Nepali. And so that's where it's a ecosystems of all organizations working on risk information. So that's what it's being housed on. Thirdly, we'd also started something called the e-learning portal within the National Disaster Management Office's website. So this is where we've been able to, again, get all these set of ideas, stories, like the ones we heard about yesterday and today, to put it as part of a learning website where municipal mayors or staff at the municipal governments would be able to learn from these trainings. So this is how we've been able to kind of engage with this. Also wanted to point that, again, to take these ideas into all municipalities, all of the countries, we're coming up with a guideline targeted towards municipal governments, the guidelines to help them how to prepare a municipal periodic plan. So this is what we're calling a local disaster resilience framework. There are colleagues from Nepal, Dr. Ranjan and his team over there. They're also helping with JICA and others, working with NDRMA to really help come up with a collective way of doing a guideline to translate some of these ideas into those fastest growing municipalities. So really want to thank you all for, again, coming and listening to our stories as how we're trying to kind of really understand risk, but also work with municipal governments, Ministry of Urban, Ministry of Local Governments to really come together and work in such a complex and a changing environment. Thank you, everyone.
And finally, thanks from me. Thanks, Thaisa. What a fantastic host she's been, the technical team, and all the team from home. I think we could stretch this to a few minutes for questions. I'm very conscious that everything's been pushed back, but we still are within our hour, I think. Does anybody have any pressing questions, please? Could we have thanks.
I have two questions. One, you mentioned that you were looking for 3 more cities to include in the project. So I'm curious how cities can be included. And my second question is just how long will the project be going?
Okay, the first question is emerging. We have an internal process. We've got a series of criteria that, for example, our funders require cities to be in the least developed country status, for example. There are other criteria. We're working at the minute with UCLG and MCR, making cities resilient. And we're open to other avenues. So we're in this process actively at the minute. We've definitely got two new cities, Nablus and Rapti. Dar es Salaam we're working with Arab there to try and arrange the engagement there. But there are 3 slots that are open. We have the funding for that whole process, and we're very keen in this environment to try and see if we can maybe start an engagement that might lead to those.
How long will the project run?
At the minute, we're funded until April 2024. So we've got about 16 months left to run on the project. Of course, we are actively looking for legacy funding, particularly NSET have become, Ramesh and his team have become the main legacy partner. So they're working on the capacity strengthening program, which we're going to improve and develop through the new cities as well as the old, and move that forward. So we really are actively searching for support for that type of thing into over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, John, thank you. This is Ranjan from Kathmandu, and my question is actually how you are planning for this kind of the urban risks in transitions for the, especially what is your threshold for the urbanization, like how you evaluate the minimum, the requirement for the urbanization that then you can apply your projects over there. So that how you decided.
Yeah, I'm sure some of my colleagues from online would I can answer that in several ways. First of all, we don't know. In other words, we're experimenting with the idea that this whole process might be used, for example, for one hospital. You know, so I don't really understand the bottom limit of that. At the minute, we're probably looking for cities that are actively thinking about urbanization at the scale of a few tens or maybe 100,000 people. That seems to be the direction that we're traveling in. But we're very open to thinking about this methodology actively with stakeholders and see how we can develop that. It's an important question. By the way, one of our absolute criteria is there are lots of challenges facing cities. We really need to make sure that there are significant and engaged natural hazards circumstances. So we're looking for earthquakes, floods, landslides. You know, that's our main focus. Though we're certain that the modular form of what we're doing could be expanded into other concerns as well, but we're staying on the natural hazards. Yes.
Rachele Gianfranchi, I'm the Government Affairs Director for Everbridge. We provide emergency communication to nationwide, but also in the case of cities, of corporates. I was wondering if your model takes into consideration how people in urban risk situation react to communication, and if the model is accounting for or recording how different forms of communication create different safety situation for the people on the ground.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And obviously we've got a communications department, you know, but I think that's a different, that's about trying to communicate with our stakeholders, really. It's not, and in a specific way, it's not really about imagining how communications might develop in a future city. And that's an important, you know, there are lots of things we haven't considered and which are clearly important. We haven't really thought. So at a talk I gave recently, people asked, what are you doing about data on infrastructure? And I thought, we haven't talked about, you know, all that important infrastructure, the data centers and stuff, and how they would be resilient. We need to do that, but we haven't thought about it yet. And we need to plan for the residual risk and how we will deal with it. No matter how well this process works, there's still residual risk, and we need to deal with that. And I see the communications as being part of that. And maybe in terms of building a culture of resilience that we've heard talked about last night, for example, which was really inspiring. We haven't really got Ramesh, that's so clearly true, but it's actually completely disconnected from the problem we're dealing with. So I can see that when these cities are developed, we need to make sure, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you've said, but we've been so tight in keeping our focus on communities that don't exist, trying to model their understandings through communities that we can access. So these people don't exist yet. The buildings don't exist yet. The roads don't exist. And what we're trying to do is not stop a group of white men sorting those problems out, and instead try and really deeply engage with the urban poor particularly, and try and make sure that their priorities are really plugged in to what happens next. And communication is going to be a big part of that. But I would like that once those cities start developing, that we immediately get in and start working with them about those key issues that will build the social resilience to help us to add that next layer to the resilience of the whole city.
Yeah, and just to add some couple of points.
Thanks.
That, we are using a couple of innovations on the communication part as well. Number one is we are building a physical 3D models for community to discuss, because even the very good GIS maps is very difficult for the community to understand. And then we are having a 3D, the timber cut models, very cheap. And then, where every buildings can be located, and then people can imagine this is my plot, this is my house. That level of the scale in the 3D physical models. That's one. The second is virtual reality. That using that for the communication. That's our team, the communication team in Tomorrow City that are working with. So we are trying different options. We don't know what's the best model yet, but we are trying different options. The physical model is very good. That NCET is trying in many of our programs, the projects, and working properly to communicate to the communities.
We didn't even mention the virtual reality. You can walk through these places and you can watch the earthquake happening and stuff. And inside is amazing. Not quite working yet, but it's a part of that vision where you're trying to get people to understand what they're signing up for. Yeah.
Thank you very much. David Lelemont, also a researcher in kind of urban risk and resilience topics. I'm a huge, admiration for this project. And one of the things I wonder is, as you start bringing kind of new cities and setting new cities, opportunities for the cities to learn from each other, and some of the work to be kind of transferred from place to place, and how and if you're planning to do that.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. And it's one that has really bugged us. I guess COVID hasn't helped, but we started with this vision of a growing international community of practice, and it didn't really materialize at this stage. And I guess one of the issues, Ramesh, is that we're now moving to a sort of centralized capacity building strategy, and that will militate against the sort of absorption of local understandings. So we do need to think about that. I would love to talk about that later, but it's a key issue, and I would put my hand up and say we're not scoring highly on that at the minute. Ramesh, would you agree? Or yeah, okay, that was a good answer.
Just want to add to that, John and David. Is in Nepal, like we have something called a national platform for DRR. This is where some of these learnings from these initiatives, these select 2 municipalities are a case in point for other municipalities to learn from. So internally within the country, we're thinking of such events. But again, this idea of how do you transcend boundaries and perhaps engage with other communities is such a nice question. Right.
I think it would be, if we can just give it 1 minute. Mark, my co-director, I think might have a comment. I don't want to put you on the spot, Mark, but would you like to comment on that?
Sure, if you can hear me well. Yeah, I think it's at the heart of our ambition to provide an international or support an international community of practice that enables peer learning. So at the moment, we've come through the kind of co-produced research stage, if you will. So we have an awful lot of exchange amongst researchers and community leaders between the cities that John and Taisa identified. And that's certainly the sort of foundation. The next step is to encourage not just community leaders, but city government officials, even political leaders, perhaps, to exchange and become champions between cities that are experiencing rapid growth. So I think John's right that hasn't yet started, but it's, you know, has this foundation of strong peer-peer learning across the cities from the researcher point of view, with all research being co-produced. And the next stage is to directly provide a structure for the policy actors to exchange as well. And that's really important, I think, for the next stage is part of transferring the ownership from the more research-led to the more policy-led parts of the consortium. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, this is in the background, and our strategy at the minute is focusing over the last few months on this capacity strengthening. So Mark, really, that's important, that we've always had this ambition, maybe not fully realized yet, but thanks, Mark. Maybe one last question. Thanks.
Just on a little bit on the cynical side, especially because from Latin American countries, especially in Central America, are worried more about continuity of the programs. So how do you deal with continuing with this type of research and programs with changing conditions, changing mayors, changing authorities, changing different actors within the program?
Yeah, again, you know, this is it's a really live issue. There's just been an election in Nepal, for example, and all of our work was, to some extent, though, and there are some constants, which was really helpful. We've gone through 2 elections in Quito, I think, and 1 election in Istanbul. None of those as yet has had a major impact on our work, but that was fingers crossed. You know, there's very little we can do about that. I think what's important is for us to build an institutional front for this within the global agencies, you know, within the World Bank, within the UNDRR, within UCLG, within these other agencies. And if we can have a really strong program, which is helping not to fossilize what we do in tomorrow's cities, but to build the community of practice that Mark referred to, that will roll out over the, you know, if we don't still exist in 10 years, then everything will have been wasted. You know, this is the critical time, the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's a utterly critical issue. It keeps me awake at night. Thanks. Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, everybody over there. Fantastic. You can see me waving that way, I think. The technical team, thanks a lot. Thaisa. Anil, thank you so much for coming from Nepal to be with us. Thank you.